So yeah, hello everyone. Thank you very much for coming to my talk. Yeah, it's great to see you, so many of you here. So this talk is gonna be all about a mobile app that I recently published on the app stores and the things that I've learned along the way, and also many technical details that went into building it. And before I start, just out of curiosity, could I have a show of hands for how many of you have actually shipped a mobile app on the stores? Oh, pretty much everyone. Great. For a few of you, so yeah, hopefully this talk will give you still some interesting takeaways and maybe some practical tips that you can use in your own apps. And before we get right into it, maybe I can start by giving you a bit of context about myself and how this app came to be. So yeah, my name is Andrea. I've been a Flutter developer and educator since 2018. And during all these years, I've been sharing all the things that I was learning on LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube, and some other channels as well. I've also created codewithandrea.com, where I share tutorials and courses about Flutter app development. And I'm very happy that this site has become a valuable resource for the community, with nearly 5 million page views to date. I think if you told me that 5 years ago, I would have not believed it, but here we are. As far as my content goes, I've been publishing anything from long-form articles and courses on my website to short-form tips and tricks, such as this one about media query. And this idea of sharing tips online came to me about 4 years ago. And when I started, I was mainly tweeting about the various features of the Dart language. And I noticed that people were interested in this type of content. So I decided to keep going, and over time, I've improved the styling and format of my tips. And I also started cross-posting them on LinkedIn, where they were also well received. And all along, the main recipe has not changed. And when I'm brainstorming, I always ask myself the same question. And that is, what can I share that is short, useful, and people might not know about? And when I do this, I just try to design some kind of graphic or illustration that captures the essence of what I'm trying to explain. So after a while, I realized that I was spending quite a fair amount of time creating all these tips. And so I decided to organize and publish them all inside a GitHub repo, which as of today contains about 170 of them. And just to give you a little idea of what this repo looks like, I'm going to try to show it to you. So yeah, this is the main repo. If I just scroll past the introduction, you basically find this section where you can see all the tips listed as a list. And if I click on any of them, then I'm taken to the corresponding page. And from here, you can just read what the tip is about. And like I said, typically it's some text with some explanation and some kind of diagram and illustration. And once you get all the way to the bottom, you find this little ugly-looking markdown table, which you can use to navigate to the previous tip or to the next one. And back then, that was my idea of how can I add navigation to GitHub as a way to explore and browse these tips. So it's a bit clunky to use, and it's not a great way of navigating the tips. But I guess when I started, it was okay as a solution. So getting back into the app. Oops, sorry. Hang on, let's do it this way. Right. Yeah, so after creating the GitHub repo, I kind of realized that there should be something better that I should be able to do, and especially as a Flutter developer. So I guess at some point, I just decided that it was time to build a mobile app and make the job much easier in doing so. So this takes me to the talk, where I'm going to tell you about how the app works, how I prepared for the release, including some of the pre-launch tasks that I wanted to have in place before going live with the app. I'm also going to tell you how the launch went and some of the lessons that I learned along the way. And I think a good way to introduce you to this is just to show you a little bit of a demo about how the app works. So as you can see, the main idea is that you can swipe left or right to see all the various tips. And if you come across an image, you can click on it, and this takes you to a zoomable image preview where you can see all the details. And in addition to the text and images, you're also going to be able to find some hyperlinks. So there are cases where maybe what I wanted to share goes a bit more in depth. So typically, these links take you to my website, where you can read about certain topics more in depth. Oops. Yep. And other than that, if you like any tips, then you can kind of star them as favorite using this button. So it's all fairly standard stuff. And in case you get bored of kind of browsing them like this, I've also added this kind of search list functionality. So here you can see all the lists in one place, sorry, all the tips in one place. And you can also use this kind of toggle just to see only your favorites. And in addition to that, you can also, whoops, mistake. Yeah, I mean, you can search the list. So if you search for one of my favorite topics, then you can find all the tips that match that specific search query. Other than that, I've added some functionality to show tips as a random selection. So you can just click here if you want to discover any random tip. And other than that, there's also this page where you find the usual options for changing the app theme, and there are also some app-specific settings. So as you can see, there's nothing like particularly extraordinary about the app. But one thing I will say is that, yeah, I mean, it does one thing and it tries to do it well. And that's what I was trying to deliver. I mean, of course, I could have added many additional features like user comments, notifications, and all of that fancy stuff. But for V1, what I wanted to do was to ship a minimum lovable product. And so that's what I tried to do. So when I started building this app, I set to myself some goals. The first one was to somehow build it and ship it in less than 100 hours. I also wanted it to be completely free for everyone to download. And crucially, that meant that it also had to be free to run. So I didn't want to have any kind of backend or any recurring costs for this specific project. And as a little bonus, I also wanted to see if it was possible with this app to drive some traffic to my main website. And this is something that I measured, and later on I'll tell you a little bit about it. In any case, making this app free meant that I had to make some interesting decisions along the way. And yeah, so given my time and budget constraints, I also had to be clear about what was out of scope. For example, it would have been nice to implement deep links and sharing so that users could share individual tips with each other. But in the end, I decided it wasn't an essential feature, at least for launch. Likewise, after the initial launch, for the initial launch, I decided to share this app on mobile only, and without having to worry too much about tablet and desktop form factors. And I also didn't want to invest too much time building complex features, at least initially, because after all, for me, this was still a side project. With that said, let me tell you a little bit about how the app works under the hood. So from a high-level point of view, this works by fetching the markdown data that it needs from the GitHub repo. Then there is some pre-processing that takes place so that I can extract this metadata and filter out any undesired content. I also do some caching to ensure that the content is available offline. And I'm also doing rendering using the Flutter Markdown package. And one interesting thing to notice is that all the processing is done on the client. Because like I said before, I didn't want to have a backend. And as we will see, these have some implications when it comes to API keys. So let me dive a bit deeper and give you an overview of each one of these stages. And as a good place to start, we can kind of look at the folder structure on GitHub. So like I said before, what we find inside it is the README file. And inside, there's this list where each, basically you can see all the tips there, each with their ID, title, and URL. And then inside each tip, there is an index.md file, and along with some images which are typically in PNG or GIF format. So when it comes to fetching the markdown data for a given tip, all I had to do is to make a call to the GitHub API and request the data from a URL that looks a bit like that. And if the request is successful, I can get the raw markdown data, which looks a bit like this. And as you would expect, the Markdown contains the content that needs to be rendered. But I've also added some HTML content comments which represent the stuff that might be useful for me or might be useful for the client app to download, but not necessarily to be rendered. And in any case, once I have the Markdown, I can go to the next step, which is pre-processing. And just to give you an idea of what the Markdown pre-processing looks like, this is a function that uses a bunch of regular expressions to remove things like tables, dividers, any specific things that might be included in the raw Markdown, but shouldn't be rendered in the client app. And if you think I managed to write all this code by myself, you're definitely overestimating my intelligence. And I will just say that I got a little bit of help from an assistant, which happens to be very good with regular expressions. And yeah, as a result of this pre-processing step, I can show you a side-by-side comparison of what is rendered in the GitHub website versus what you can see in the mobile app. And yeah, the idea is that while the GitHub version shows some navigation kind of content, it's not really content, the mobile app doesn't really need that. So now that we talked about fetching and pre-processing, let me tell you also how I went about caching. And in terms of requirements, I wanted the content to be always available offline. And I thought it would be a good idea to choose a relational database so that I could more easily run some queries. And after doing a little bit of research, I ended up choosing Drift and SQLite. And to be fair, I think this is quite a simple app still. So perhaps a NoSQL database would have worked just as well. But yeah, I've been wanting to learn more about Drift and SQLite for some time, so this seemed like a good opportunity to do so. So how did I go about caching the Markdown files? Well, as it turns out, I only create new tips generally maybe once or twice a week. I actually fairly rarely update the old tips. And this means that I don't really need to be aggressive when it comes to fetching data from the server. And a 7-day cache window seemed appropriate for this specific use case. So what I ended up doing was to create a riverpod provider that is used to fetch a Markdown tip. And then inside, I can check if the tip is already stored in the database. And I also check if it was cached more than 7 days ago. And if that's the case, I fetch it again from the server. But either way, I return the cached value and not the one from the server. And the catch there is that if the tip has already been updated on the server, it will only be shown the next time it is requested. And overall, this is not a big deal because all the logic, basically this provider is called every time you swipe left or right in the app. So even if the first time you didn't get a tip, which I rarely update anyway, the second time you swipe back to it, then you will get it. So that's for the content itself, but what about caching images? Well, when I started, I just wanted to get something working, and for that, the cached network image package was a good solution. So that also has a configurable cache expiry time, which I set to 7 days. And yeah, to be fair, that has worked fairly well. However, there is one problem there, because all the images that are older than 7 days will be removed unconditionally. And that is not the behavior that I wanted, because if the app is offline, I'd much rather keep the older images than delete them and have nothing to show. So I did a bit of kind of digging into that, and it turns out that customizing the behavior of this package, as far as cache strategy goes, it's not so easy. So maybe in the future, I will try to implement my own image caching strategy directly using Drift. So now that I talked about fetching and caching, maybe I'll tell you a little bit about rendering. And as you may know, rendering Markdown data in Flutter, it's mostly a case of using a single widget called Markdown, which comes from the Flutter Markdown package. And for the most part, this was quite straightforward, because all I had to do was to provide some custom styling and then override the on-top link callback in order to use the URL launcher, which is needed whenever we encounter a link that we want to open with the browser. And also, I decided to override the image builder so that I could plug in my own custom cached network image, and also intercept any tabs so that I could open the zoomable image preview. So overall, that literally is the core of the rendering, and it fits in one slide. So that was really quite easy to do. So yeah, this completes the overview of how the app works in terms of fetching, pre-processing, caching, and rendering the markdown data. And one thing that is quite clear from this is that I've used GitHub as a data source. And in fact, we could say that this repo, like the GitHub repository, acts as some kind of content management system for the app. And as we have seen, by making some calls to the GitHub REST API, I was able to fetch the data that I needed. However, the GitHub API comes with some limitations. In particular, that's the right one. I soon discovered that the primary rate for an authenticator requests is 60 requests per hour. And it's very, very easy to exceed this, especially on this app where you can swipe quickly between all the different tips. On the other hand, authenticated users can make up to 5,000 requests per hour. And as it turns out, what you can do is to create a fine-grained personal access token, which can be scoped to a specific repository with read-only access. And the only drawback of that is that the token is only valid for up to 1 year, and after that, you need to generate a new one. So that was good enough for me, because I didn't want to have any backend at all. So what I ended up doing is to hard code this access token on the client. Then I've implemented a force upgrade mechanism, which is controlled by Firebase remote config. And what that means is that next year, I will generate a new token and upload a new version of the app. And then I can trigger the force upgrade for all the users and be sorted for another year. And to be fair, maybe a more effective approach would have been to store the access token itself inside Firebase remote config, and then fetch it and store it inside secure storage. And I think, yeah, that maybe would have been a better solution, but by the time I realized this, I already built the previous version, and I decided that it wasn't worth to kind of rewrite the entire logic for that. And either way, I would say, I mean, it's fair to say that neither approach is entirely secure, because the token is still stored on the client. And in some kind of ideal scenario, maybe the client should make requests through an intermediate server, which in turn manages the communication with the GitHub API. But yeah, if I'm honest, even if someone steals this token, they can't really do much with it, because all it does is give it access to the repository, so it can only read data from that repository. So it's not really a big security issue for me. So once again, the entire logic for fetching and preprocessing lives on the client, and it worked fairly well given the requirements of this project. But like I said, it has some limitations. So if I wanted to build a more flexible solution, I would have probably created a separate backend, which would take care of fetching, processing, storing the data inside the database, and making that available to the client by some kind of API. And I think by doing so, I would have been able to circumvent the access token limitations. Maybe I would have even been able to enable kind of server-side real-time updates and other nice things. But again, this client-only solution was good enough for this particular project. So that's how I decided to build the app and keep it simple that way. Right, so now you have an overview of kind of how the app works. So let's move on, and I want to maybe tell you a little bit about how I prepare for the release. So as part of this, I'll tell you a bit about my force upgrade logic. We'll cover automated testing, error monitoring, analytics. I also want to share, I think, what is a fairly cool tip for showing the in-app review prompt at the right time. I'll also tell you a bit about a template that helped me get a website up and running very quickly for this app. And maybe I'll talk a bit briefly about CI and CD. So let's start with the force upgrade logic. And as you can see, this is mainly a case of taking the required app version, which is stored in Firebase remote config, and comparing it with the current app version, which I can get from the package info. And as a reminder, I expect to trigger the force upgrade logic once a year whenever my GitHub access token expires. However, I made one little mistake, because this is probably something to do with me using ChatGPT a bit too much, but I ended up hard coding the wrong app URLs for actually pulling the updated version of the app. And this was a good lesson for me that maybe I should remember to check all the to-dos that I put in my code, and actually test the force upgrade path when making a release. But yeah, when it comes to automated testing, there's a very short story here. Yeah, I didn't write any tests because, to be honest, again, in this case, I wanted to ship fast, and I didn't really factor writing tests into my time budget. However, I did add some monitoring code so that I could track any errors that happen in production. And I'm very thankful that I did that because there were a handful of bugs that I didn't catch before release, and those ended up affecting my users. So for example, one issue is that when I set up the URL launcher package, I made a mistake, and I forgot to update the correct settings in the Android manifest file. And as a result, all the Android users could not open any external URLs, and that showed right away in Sentry. Another issue I encountered is that some large GIF images were not loading, especially for users on low-end devices. And this is exactly the kind of thing that error monitoring solution might tell you, and you might not discover by yourself. Another issue I discovered is that some images were not found, and that was more like a programmer mistake from my side because I was pointing to the incorrect image URL from my markdown. So yeah, it was good to have some kind of error reporting to catch all those things. And in my experience, I did find Sentry to be more useful than Crashlytics. Like it has some advanced kind of reporting and filtering capabilities, many extra features such as user feedback. But yeah, it's up to you. Like it's worth noting that Sentry free plan is quite limited. You can only retain data for up to 30 days and a maximum of 5,000 errors. If you need integrations, such as, for example, if you want a GitHub issues integration with Sentry, you need to upgrade to the team plan. So that's just something to be aware about. Next, I want to talk a bit about analytics. So when it comes to Flutter, there's literally so many packages that you can choose from. So I think after doing a bit of research, I ended up with two of, I guess, the most popular, which are Firebase Analytics and Mixpanel. Both of these services offer a customizable dashboard where you can see the active users and many other useful metrics like acquisition, engagement, retention, and all of that good stuff. To be fair, also App Store Connect and the Play Store console give you some analytics reports, but what they don't do is to show you, basically, if you want to track custom events, then you can only do that with the client SDKs. So, in fact, it's fair enough to say that each app is different, so you probably want to measure some kind of key performance indicators and get insights about user behavior and engagement. And for me, there were three important KPIs that I wanted to measure, such as how many tips users like in the app, which were the most liked tips, and the total number of tips liked by each user. So what I ended up doing for this last one, which actually was the most interesting to me, was to store the total likes count inside shared preferences. And then whenever a user likes a certain tip, I could send a tip liked event along with the total likes count as a property to my analytics client. And once all this data was available, it was easy enough to generate a custom report with Mixpanel. So for example, this screenshot is showing that on the 22nd of April, 267 tips have been liked. And this is another report showing the 75th and 90th percentile for the maximum number of total likes per user. And what this tells me essentially is how many tips are liked by the most engaged users. But what can I do with this information? Well, suppose you want to ask users to rate the app if they're having a good experience. I think we can all agree that a good time to do this is when the like button is pressed. However, we don't want to show this prompt the very first time the user likes a tip, because that would be too annoying. But we don't want to wait too long either. Otherwise, most users will not even see the prompt. So how do we decide when to show the prompt? Well, thanks to the information I collected previously, I know how many tips are liked by users in the 75th and 90th percentile. And so what I can do is to come up with an algorithm that, in this case, uses some kind of exponential backoff function to decide when to show the app rating prompt. And the parameters of this algorithm are derived from the data I got from my analytics. So this guarantees that only the most engaged users will ever see the rating prompt. And this has worked fairly well in practice. Next up, I can tell you a little bit about the website template that I used to build the website for this app. So of all the options that I considered, this was the one that seemed to tick all the boxes, and it was very quick and easy to set up. Basically, you just fork a GitHub repo, you edit some properties, and there you go. Bam, you got a website done for your app. It will include like a screenshot, the download buttons. If you open it on native Safari, it's quite nice. You see the extra banner at the top telling you you can download the app from the App Store. Really quite nice. In a couple of hours, I got that done, and I was happy with that. Next, CI. Of course, there are many different vendors that you can use for automating your builds and releases. Overall, I've been quite happy with CodeMagic since it just makes it very easy to get things working with the visual workflow editor. I was also fairly happy with the customer support, which was responsive, and they were quite good in a couple of occasions. But I think perhaps the biggest takeaway here is not about which vendor you should choose, but rather about the importance of setting up CI in the first place, because this makes deployments so much easier. So this kind of completes the overview of all the pre-launch tasks. And while setting up all these things can take some time, I think it's worth it to have them in place before launch. So how did I go about the launch strategy? Well, my idea was to launch on iOS first, since this was the platform where I did most of the testing. And before launching on Android, I decided to run a private beta with some testers to try and catch some bugs ahead of time. And this was indeed a good idea because I was able to then start some conversations with the users. And one user in particular, it really took the time to give me a lot of feedback, and that was super valuable. Oh yeah, I should also mention that I used the feedback package to more easily collect in-app feedback, and that is so easy. Literally, it's like a 5-minute integration, and really nice. What's great about it also is that it has an integration that can automatically capture a screenshot with the user feedback, and it sends it to Sentry. And from there, I can basically then review all the user feedback directly within Sentry. So that was also quite useful, especially when you just launch and you have maybe a bit of a marketing push, if you call it that way, and you might get a lot of those all in one go. So it's kind of nice to have one place to capture all of that. So that's it in terms of user feedback. I want to tell you a little bit about how the launch went. So in the first 2 months since launch, managed to get about 2.4 total downloads between iOS and Android. As far as the reviews went, I managed to get about 80 reviews in total with some pretty good average rating scores on both stores. And but that's not the whole story. So of course, if you want to keep going with the app, you have to think about user acquisition. So I'll admit that after the initial launch, things fizzled out quite a bit. These days, my downloads are more like in the single digits. And to be fair, I did spend a bit of time doing App Store optimization, managed to rank for a couple of keywords, but these are pretty low search volume keywords. So I can't really rely on them as an acquisition channel. So if I ever decide to spend more time on this project, I should probably improve my acquisition strategy. And maybe a good place to start with that would be to improve my App Store listings, maybe make the screenshots more enticing, and those kind of things. Other than that, when it comes to engagement, the stats say that I have about 100 daily active users on average. The average engagement time is about 7 minutes per user, or close to 4 minutes per session. I think this is not too bad, considering that the app is about digestible short-form content, but I don't publish a lot of apps, so I don't have a lot of comparison data to check against. There is, however, one other point that I want to consider, and that is, how much did this app contribute to the traffic on my main website? The answer is that only 0.27% of unique visitors came to my site from the mobile app. And as of today, the big traffic sources are Google and direct traffic, and that's kind of by design in the way I share and decide what kind of content to write for my site. Also worth saying that I share many of my tips on LinkedIn and Twitter, where I have a fairly sizable audience. So these platforms also contribute far more traffic than the mobile app. So yeah, if I'm honest, this small amount of traffic was maybe expected, because only a few of my Flutter tips include links to the articles anyway, and the links are not very prominent. But yeah, overall, I'm quite happy that I could get the app in the hands of users and that their feedback so far has been positive. I'm also happy to report that the launch went quite well initially until it kind of didn't. So soon after launch, I received this lovely email from the Google Play team informing me that the app was rejected and removed from the store. And apparently, the reason for the rejection was violation of impersonation policy due to my app icon and title. And this kind of took me a bit by surprise. I didn't think there was anything wrong with my app icon, which, by the way, is generated with Midjourney. But after reading the Flutter brand guidelines and some discussions with the Play Store team, I kind of realized that apparently my icon was too similar to the Flutter logo. I don't know if you agree, but whatever. So yeah, I ended up kind of choosing a different Midjourney icon. Good that I did 4 in the first place. And then I also added the trademark symbol to the app name, which, whatever. So yeah, after submitting these changes, the app was reinstated. And so I guess the takeaway from this whole thing is Play Store really treats copyright and trademark infringement very seriously. So if you don't comply, your app might be removed without notice. And this can be very inconvenient depending on what your business is. So yeah, just something to keep in mind. So, right, so before wrapping up, I want to maybe share some takeaways and also some of the lessons that I've learned. First takeaway is, personally, I think that GitHub is great as a content management system. In fact, you can kind of use it as a document store so as long as you ensure that your folders and files are following a certain structure, then you can use the REST API to fetch your data and show that in the UI. Markdown is also great. So in situations where you want to show some rich text with some basic formatting, images, hyperlinks, and so on, I think that works great. And as we have seen, the Flutter Markdown package can do most of the heavy lifting for you. However, it only offers some pretty basic customization options. For example, if you want to show some code blocks with syntax highlighting, you're out of luck. Another feature that is not supported, that we take for granted on the web, is selectable Markdown text. So if you try to wrap a Markdown widget with a selectable area, you get a runtime exception, and that's a bit unfortunate. Yeah, and what this all means is that, once I ported the Flutter tips app to the web, I think I ended up with an okay-ish experience, but not great. And if I wanted to offer a great user experience on web, I probably would end up rewriting it with something like Astro, which I also love. But yeah, other than that, I was very happy with Drift. This is well supported on iOS, Android, and web. And that allowed me to create an offline first experience with ease. So very happy with that. So in closing, I also want to share some of the lessons that I learned. And I will preface that by saying that the things I learned from this project are probably applicable if you're an indie developer. If you're working on big enterprise apps, maybe some of this advice might not apply. But yeah, with that said, if you have an idea for some kind of side project and you actually want to ship it, these are the things that work for me. The first one is to really focus on one core problem that your app should solve and try to build and ship that. And this is something that allowed me to get feedback early and iterate. I also was mindful of the time that it takes to deal with App Store submissions, creating a landing page, app icons, screenshots, and all that stuff. I did get a lot of value from automating the releases on CI, which just allowed me to deploy new versions just by pressing a button. And on that note, I'm a big fan of making small releases. and making them often, because that reduces the chances of introducing bigger bugs and breaking too much stuff all in one go. I also found it like really important to add instrumentation with analytics and error monitoring, because this allowed me to get good insights and fix things that were broken in production. And yeah, another thing I actually did for this project was to add multiple flavors, so that I could, yeah, basically easily have separate environments for my analytics, error monitoring, and all of that stuff. And this is especially important if your app does have a backend. And while I didn't write any tests for version 1, I did later get to a point where I feel like I should have maybe added some integration tests. So that's something else to consider. And yeah, as a note of caution, be careful about trademarks with your app icon and name. And the last thing you want is for your app to be taken down without notice. And that's it. I mean, of course, there are many more things. If you want your app to be a commercial success, there are many more things to consider. But at least in my experience, following these steps has been quite effective, and I was able to ship this app without wasting too much time and kind of get it quickly in the hands of users. So that's it. I think I've reached the end of the talk. I hope you found it interesting. On a final note, if you want to download the app, you can get it from fluttertips.dev. If you have any feedback about this talk, you can submit it with the QR code. And as a little bonus, if you do submit the feedback, you get redirected to the page where I published these slides already. So yeah, that's it. Thank you very much for attending, and I'm happy to take any questions.